everyone. Welcome back to Life Unpotted. This is Daisy here. Of course, as always, before we jump into today's episode, I want to give you a few updates on what's been going on with Life Unpotted. And recently, as you probably saw, we had our first New York City meetup in Central Park. It was so much fun. There was probably about 15, 16 people there. And it was so great to see everyone and to have everyone in one area and a park, especially. Such a great environment. It was the most beautiful day. And it was just so great to connect with everyone and just generally just be in the vicinity of a bunch of great people. We're so excited to continue to do more. And our next one, as we are finishing up our move out of New York City, will be in Austin, Texas. So if you are local there or travel there often, stay tuned because it'll be very soon that we'll be able to have an event there. And just for everyone who came, we appreciate your support. You are what makes this community great. So look out for what else is to come. And speaking of community, if you like this podcast, please go right now, rate it, review it, give us how many stars you like. Hopefully it's 5 stars, but it's super easy on Spotify. You just give us 5 stars. You can leave a review or don't have to on Apple Music, but please go do that. And also, even more importantly, subscribe. You'll get a notification each Tuesday that we release an episode. You won't ever have to miss one. It'll get automatically downloaded to your phone. So that time, when you're on the airplane and you're like, oh, I don't have anything to listen to. If you subscribe, it'll automatically download to your phone. So you'll be prepared to listen to us when you are on that flight. So please do that. Let us know if you do it. And we'll thank you if you do. We appreciate you. Thanks for being here.
We're growing, man. Like, this podcast is growing. We were just posting on our Instagram page yesterday, kind of the last year of our growth. And you see, we started back in, I guess, May of 2022. And you see throughout the years, like, it was a little bump growth, a little bit. And all of a sudden, the past, 4 months, we've just skyrocketed. We really couldn't have done it without you guys, without this audience. So as Daisy said, please take the time because your support means a lot. And I just want to comment briefly on the event. I think that it was really important for me, that event. I think it really showed me that this is real, that Life Unpotted is happening, that we are building this community, and just to reflect back on, where maybe I was before the event and being nervous and being anxious about it and feeling like, oh, who am I to host an event? And having all that imposter syndrome and everything, and then getting there and then seeing the turnout and just seeing the community come to life was really a beautiful milestone for Life Unpotted, and just for everything we talk about to show that if you try, you will succeed. And it may not happen right away. It may take time, but you are so much more capable than you may think. And hosting an event, for example, I've had no prior experience ever hosting any sort of meetup or event, but we did it, right? Like, you can do anything that you want to do. You have to just believe in yourself. And just to get into today's episode, I think a topic that kind of prevents us from recognizing our potential and recognizing what we can really do in this life is anxiety. The anxious thoughts that arise in our mind that make us feel scared and make us feel like we can't do things, or make us feel overwhelmed, or make us feel so stressed out about taking next steps in life, or just really anxiety about where you are in life. So I kind of thought we haven't really done an episode about anxiety, even though a lot of the stuff we talk about is about, calming your mind and everything. But I think the feeling of anxiety is a very specific one. We all can relate. I guess just to get started about anxiety. I know for me, with this move that's going on and all the changes that's going on, I've had feelings where anxiety is really prevalent in my experience in that moment. And what it feels like to me is kind of like this overwhelmed feeling of fear, of kind of just feeling like there's no way that things are going to work out. And I really notice this especially with moving, especially when you have so many things to do in one day. And I think it's really hard to realize in these moments that the only thing that you can do, the only thing that you can focus on is what's in front of you. This applies to every single thing we do in life. We can only literally focus on this very moment. So why don't we get started with this topic, Daisy? What are your thoughts on anxiety?
Well, that's a very loaded question. So I'll start off with personal experience from this very day today that we're literally recording. I think what you said about moving, I've been packing the apartment up the past 2 days, and past 2 days, been going great. Been having fun with it. Really a helpful way to process things. But really today I woke up and I was exhausted, was very tired. And I think I was just overall feeling overwhelmed with like boxes and things and miscellaneous little items everywhere. It was all starting to get to me. Like my mental brain power, my mentality, my brain power, all of it was just, I was just really tired. And there's a time crunch, there's end dates, yada, yada, yada. And it goes on. So yes, all of those things can be anxiety inducing. They totally can be, but it's so easy to confuse like, oh, I'm feeling like I need a break right now. But it's so easy to say, oh, I can't take a break because there's an end date. And you start thinking about all the things you have to do in the future, in the next 48 hours. And it's really easy to allow yourself to get more and more and more worked up. And I kind of came out of this, like I caught myself feeling really anxious about everything happening and kind of like getting frustrated and angry about it, that we only have 48 hours and this and that. We have to podcast, we have to do all these things. And I recognized after like going for a walk and going and dropping clothes off at Goodwill and such, I really recognized that I was getting really caught up in it. I was getting caught up in the anxiety. And that's kind of the lesson for me, is that you can always kind of acknowledge the anxiety and step away from it. But when you're in those really intense moments where you're taking the anxiety really seriously, it's really hard to do that. But I think leaving whatever task you're doing aside, because I clearly was projecting it all onto everything around me, and I was like really feeding into it. I think it's really easy to feed into things. I used to be a very, very, very anxious person, especially when I first moved to New York and was doing the commute every day, was always in fight or flight. My nervous system was always super dysregulated, and it's gotten a lot better, I recognize, because I see how this incident today, it lasted probably 2 or 3 hours in total. And now I'm like, my nervous system's not dysregulated. I think that's probably a whole other topic, like nervous system dysregulation, but constant anxiety can really lead to that point. And I think that's where it kind of starts to feel overwhelming. But like doing a meditation, like that open meditation you set up for me yesterday, Sophie, like that truly, because I was feeling anxious yesterday too, it truly like reset my system. So I think there's a lot of valleys we can dive into on this topic of anxiety, but just to kick things off antidotally, that has been my experience the last 24 hours.
Yeah, there's a lot there to talk about, and I think maybe the second half of the episode, as if we ever go as planned, we can maybe talk about the things to help alleviate anxiety, like breath work. I've really been realizing that. But just to kind of dive into anxiety in general, like I think the feeling of anxiety is interesting because it's like a feeling that comes up of lack of control. I think is the best way to describe it for me, right? It's like whatever situation that you're in, you have fear, you're scared, you're not trusting it, you feel anxious, right? And it's like when we it's interesting because we get so used to kind of using these words to pinpoint our emotions. I think that's great, right? Being able to say, I'm anxious. But I think sometimes that becomes an issue when we start identifying so much with it, right? Like, I am somebody who gets anxious. I am somebody who gets anxious when we're moving, when we're packing. These kind of situations make me anxious. When we're perceiving the emotions from that level, we're not diving deep enough, I don't think. Because I think we're really looking at them as this emotion that is us and not really questioning and trying to understand the root of it. Because when we really zoom out, we take a breath, we recognize we're living this life that is flashing before our eyes. We are in this human body with our hearts beating, our eyes blinking, our senses, our lungs functioning. We're on this earth. We can really zoom out and say, okay, wait, I'm just so caught up in this right now, but why? Why am I really caught up in this? And I think what I've really been thinking about is kind of like, I think we truly think that things will go wrong. Like we think that we won't be able to handle what happens. And I think that what anxiety really is just fear. And it's the fear of not being able to handle what happens. I used to think about when I used to date. Oh my God, the anxiety I had when I used to date, when I was single in New York City, like when I was like 23, 24, 25. And if I didn't get that text back, fight or flight. And for in what world would it make sense for my body to go into fight or flight because the person I was seeing or dating didn't respond to me? Now in hindsight, like reflecting on that, you realize all it is is the lack of control. And I think we hate more than anything when we can't control things. But when you dive a little bit deeper into that, and you dive a little bit deeper into trying to understand the idea of control, or really the illusion of control, you get to a point where you realize that we as humans think that we need control in order for life to pan out the way that's meant to pan out for us. And I've seen it time after time again happen in my life that when I don't have control, life actually ends up working out a lot better than I ever thought. Think about our flight that ended up getting canceled. Or, perfect situation we haven't even mentioned, our first event got rained out. Think about how perfect the event was, the meetup we had, right? I remember noticing a little bit of anxiety when our meetup got canceled or got rained on, right? And it's just like, you could never know in any given moment what any sort of experience means for the grand scheme of your life. And if we can remember that the next time we feel anxious, we'll realize that anxiety is not anything more than a lack of trust in the situation as it's unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot there, but I think one of the things I realized as you were talking is that as soon as we get into the level of anxiety where it's not an actual threat, like our ancestors getting chased by a bear, when we're actually in that state, I think 99% of the time, unless it's like truly like actually provoked, 99% of the time we're taking things way too seriously. I think if anxiety arises, like we're taking life way too seriously, because it has to work out. Like we have to be out of here. We have to pack. Like it's going to happen one way or another. It's going to happen. So I think getting fixated on something, there is a level, the whole thing of like you feed the good wolf or you feed the bad wolf, whichever one you feed is the one that wins. And I think it feels really good to feed the bad wolf on our shoulder sometimes because it gives us some sort of like relief of like, it feels good to push ourselves down sometimes and to go further into anxiety. But it's also really painful to cross the bridge from the bad wolf to the good wolf. But it can happen in 3 seconds. You can just decide that you no longer want to be living in this place of negative thoughts and believing the negative thoughts and letting them fester into physical anxiety, mental anxiety, emotional anxiety. You can just kind of release it and walk over a few steps and say, hey, I actually don't have to believe in any of this. I can let it go. I can take a break. I can walk away from whatever this is. It's making me anxious. So I think that recognizing that it's not that hard to walk away from. It's the anxiety telling us it is, because this is everything. It's fulfilling our entire life, our entire world. Everything is coming down to this one little thing we're so fixated on. And I like going back to like our early 20s. I know we actually want to do an episode on like writing a letter to our 23-year-old selves, because that would be fascinating. I think a lot of our listeners are in that age range and surely have had a ton of realization since then. I think it's a really hard age. But looking back at that age, I was taking everything really seriously. I think that's part of what that makes that age really hard, is that you take things really seriously. So you have a tendency to get really anxious when you take things seriously. So I'd be curious to explore that correlation between taking things seriously and anxiety.
Before you said that, I was thinking about like my early 20s. And I think naturally, your early 20s are a time where you are really anxious because you kind of don't know otherwise. Like you're just venturing into the world, you're figuring things out. If assuming you've gone down that traditional path of going to college and graduating. And I think the anxiety that used to come up when I was late to work or I was late to a workout class, like there was so much concern there. I was so concerned about life working out. And it's like, I'm trying to think now about things that maybe I've unlearned that used to make me more anxious than they do. I think a huge one right now, like I'm spending money from my savings and, I'm slowly starting to make money, but nowhere near the income I had as a lawyer, nowhere near. But I've recognized that like I could sit here, I could worry, I could try to figure things out in this very moment, or I could just trust. And I think why it's really hard, and I think exactly what you said, is because number one, we're taking life way too seriously. But number two, we think that we have to know in this moment how to solve the situation. We think that if something's going wrong in our life, we have to fix it right now. And I think in some situations, okay, there's differences, right? Okay, you just left your job. You're trying to figure out your life. That's a little bit different than I'm feeling really anxious because I'm on the subway and I'm running late and I'm supposed to meet a friend. I think in the latter situation where it's an active event that's happening with maybe a beginning and an end time frame that exists within that, within that 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever. I think in those moments, you have to recognize that like, okay, if you're late, then what? Oh, your friend gets mad, then what? Oh, then you have to deal with that uncomfortable conversation, then what? Like when you go down the line, you realize that like there's something that you're scared of happening. And it's that fear that is creating the anxiety.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It goes back to, in some ways, control. Like I'm kind of just reflecting, going back to the example of me packing up the apartment. I have the last 2 days woke up early and packed the entire day. So I'm just looking at where I am now. I woke up early, started doing it, realized that was not the place. It's now 3:00. We're podcasting. I'm feeling really good. I'm feeling totally re-energized. So what if I pack from 5 until midnight, because I'm feeling really energized and feeling really good now because I took space away from what was making me anxious. And I think that the irony of anxiety is that it tells us to dive deeper into this idea of what's making us anxious, whether it's being late to meet a friend or packing up your apartment. We want to fixate on it further and further and further. And when we do that, it just perpetuates it and makes it so much worse. When in reality, you don't know what's best for you. This is goes back to the whole argument. There is no such thing as good or bad because you just don't know what's going to happen. You're acting like if you're going to be late to a 5:00 thing by 15 minutes, and I'm one of those people, it's going to be the end of the world. Everyone's going to be mad at me. I'm going to be rude. I'm going to be seen as disrespectful. All of these different things when it's like you're just getting caught up in an idea of yourself because you can't control the train times. You can't control these things. You're getting fixated in an idea of I'm someone who's on time and I'm someone who's early, yada, 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 yada. And I think if you're able to accept things as they are in the moment, you free up so much energy and so much space in your mind to be able to actually enjoy it, think creatively maybe to get out of the situation you're in. Like I just am realizing things are going to happen whether you're anxious, whether you're sad, whether you're happy, whether you're mad. Things are going to happen regardless. So I think letting go of feeling this need to be right or perfect allows you to have a lot more fun with it, and there's really no reason to be anxious.
I think it's an Alan Watts quote, no amount of anxiety will ever change the outcome of a situation. And it's so funny.
That's hilarious.
Right? It
Yeah,
is
it's a really
hilarious when you think about it because
Yeah.
it's like we're standing here, we're basically punching ourselves in the face by being anxious, saying, I need to fix this, I need to fix this, I need to fix this. As if you think that you can really control the outlook. Let's really go, you're on the train, right? You're on the train, you're going to a dinner. The train, all of a sudden, you're in New York City, the subway stops. You sit there, the anxiety starts coming in of, I want to be late. What if my friends get there first? Oh my God, I don't want to be late. Like whatever. All of these things start coming up. And in this moment, you have two choices. You sit there and you say, oh my God, what am I going to do? Is the train moving yet? Is the train moving? What's going to happen? Oh, you start asking people, why is the train not moving? Why is the train not moving? What's happening? And I've definitely been in those situations of like that option A is you're trying to figure out a way to understand the situation and therefore number two, you can control it, manipulate it, right? Like if you can give me the update on the train, I can sit here and just try to have a sense of, I'm looking for a sense of relief. Or option two, you recognize you can give yourself that relief. You can give yourself that sense of relief. And I think of someone like my mom, her being like, and I don't know if my mom listens to this podcast, so if she does, no offense to you, Mom, but of her being like, no, everything is stressful. Life is stressful. I'm stressed right now. And I remember like telling her in the past, I'm like, Mom, like, no, like stress, you can't find stress. It does not exist tangibly. Maybe you can feel energy, but like your coffee machine can't make you stressed. It is your idea that it makes you stressed. So I just think it's really, we think in order to find that relief, we need that situation to go the expected way. And that I think is exactly why we cling to anxiety.
So another take, this is going to draw from an experience of when I went to Crossroads today to drop off clothes for sale. There was a really long line. People were dropping off like pounds and pounds and pounds of clothes. So there there was a difference in how people were handling it. And I had an interesting experience. I'll go into that. But one being, I saw people who were relaxing. They're there with a friend. They're laughing off. They're having fun. And then there's another person who was clearly really anxious and was kind of like looking around the room, was looking over, was looking back at me, was like very, very clearly anxious. And regardless, everyone's going to be there the same amount of time. No matter how you're feeling, people are just going to be able to enjoy it. And me, as someone who in that experience noticed that and noticed how I was being, and I was being a little bit anxious and a little bit like, come on, hurry up in my head. Like you can kind of read body language really well on that. And I recognized, well, I'm here. Things are happening either way. So I'm noticing the difference between other people. And it's not that enjoyable to be around people who just seem like antsy and angry and upset because of how things are going. So I kind of let go of it. But going back to your train example, Soph, I think that another way to look at it is, I think if you are someone who has been repressing their feelings for a few days, a few weeks, or hell, a few years, I don't know, you are probably just projecting. If the train's not going on time, it's just, and you're upset about it, you're anxious about it, it's just a projection from those feelings that aren't getting attention from you. So say, I don't know, your boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with you a week before you're stuck on this train and you're thinking about all of these things that need to happen. All these things are happening in your brain and the train stops. You're like, oh great, another thing is not going my way, right?
Isn't that all it ever is though? Like, aren't we just continuously walking around with this fuse that for some of us, this fuse goes back to emotions we haven't dealt with from when we were 15 years old, and it's like this fuse just keeps growing and it keeps growing and it's almost like dynamite. It's like getting ready to explode. Like I personally know when I have not felt certain emotions, and I've been on a journey now where I've felt emotions from when I was 15, I felt emotions from when I was 23, right? Like really have experienced on a deep level what these feelings have that I've suppressed feel like. But when something new happens and I don't really process it, I find myself on that train and I just want to cry. When you haven't been processing your emotions or connecting to yourself, your irritability or your kind of like your fuse is much shorter. It's so much shorter. And I think in those moments, it's so much easier to get anxious, to get angry, to get upset. And you're like so convinced it's the situation that's making you upset, when in reality, if you were calm, if you had connected with yourself, if you had dealt with those emotions, and I think for some people this might be hard to understand because like I'm talking about the deep shit. Like I'm talking about the work. Like if you have not confronted certain emotions or dove deep and like whether that's through therapy or psychedelics or whatever it may be, those emotions are harboring in you. They are always there, and they're going to be controlling your life until you make the decision to look at them. And I think that works in different scales, right? I think that works in, like we said, from 10 years ago, and that works for things that are happening in this moment. But I just think that like our entire life is accumulation of all of these emotions. And it's just like going back to that train example, you're anxious because the train's going to be late. Like, why do you think that your worth or who you are is dictated on whether you're late or not? Like you said, we're taking it so freaking seriously. We're losing sight of the fact that whatever happens in your life does not have anything to do with your self-worth. Like it does not change that you're whole and complete. It does not change this inner deep connection of love that exists. And I had one of these moments the other day where I was meditating and I did a 20-minute body scan, and it was like flooded with love. I was flooded with clarity. I was flooded with this warm feeling of comfort. And I just think that like that feeling, I think is the base feeling for all of us, is the base feeling for every single human being. But unfortunately, the reality of this human experience is that it's hard to tap into that when we have so many other emotions that are on top of it. Like think of it like a cake with different layers. If the core love is on the bottom of it, you have to go through all of those different layers to get to this point where you could feel that love.
A lot of thoughts happening right now. First of all, thinking, well, I've been ultra disconnected from myself the past few days because I've been waking up, chugging caffeine, packing, doing the same thing over and over and over again. And that has made me really efficient. I've focused all my attention just on these things, like going. But I think that's why I woke up today feeling so drained, because I haven't taken any moment for myself to just connect with myself, to relax. And relaxing doesn't have to be this long thing. It can be like a 5-10 minute thing where you just like let yourself deeply relax. You clear your space and let yourself do that and catch a breath and let your emotions catch up with you. And it just, that thought made me think of our larger society at a whole and more laborious jobs, and how those have a very clear defined end game of what you're supposed to get done, and how when it's Groundhog's Day every single day and you're focused on that on a loop over and over and over, 8-hour, 9-hour, 12-hour, 14-hour days, when that's all you're focused on, is you're just exhausted. You don't have time to like give yourself attention. So I just think like on a mass scale, and the reason we've been able to go so deep and emotions and looking at them and working through them is because that's became our full-time job for the past few months. We've focused on that. So I'm curious to ask you, Soph, because I think you started to do this at your past job before you left. How can you balance having a full-time job that is demanding and also giving yourself attention, or specifically your emotions attention, so that you don't have to continuously suppress them and go on autopilot and not be working in tandem with them to have a more fulfilling, like you said, full of love, peaceful life?
I think it's a really great question, because the reality of it is we need to work to make money. And while we can talk about all the alternative paths, even if you are working for yourself, right? Even in the most ideal scenario, there's going to be times when you're really busy. And like you said, Daisy, like, I think it's important to note that you did have to get shit done the past 3 days, right? Like, and that's why you did wake up early and you did have caffeine. So sometimes, like, we can't always exist in this like healing emotional state at all times. And
nor do I think we should.
No, I don't think we should either. But I think it's like, maybe, so going back to when I was at my job as a lawyer, I started really carving out time in the morning, like really, really trying to. I'd wake up, I would meditate, I'd go for a walk, I would try to do yoga or some sort of movement if I could. I would journal, and then I started bringing my journal to work so I could write down my thoughts throughout the day. If I was in a situation at work that felt really stressful, like I was in a really busy project or really busy deal, I'd bring my journal with me to work and I would start writing down. I was like, I feel really overwhelmed right now. I feel really scared. I feel really anxious. And like, creating some sort of format that you can have while doing these things, and whether that's 5 minutes of breath work, 5 minutes of breath work, 3 minutes of breath work, can reset your entire nervous system. I think that it's really important to mention this whole concept of like, we don't have time to sit here and meditate all day. And I think the goal though is to, number one, start using resources like meditation or breath work or journaling in our free time so that we can set our body up to be ready to tackle the day. Number two, remembering what we learn from things like meditating and breath work, so that when you are at your office or you are at your job, breathing is free. You can breathe anywhere. You could be, sitting at your desk and you say, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Okay. You can breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 2, breathe out for 6. There's so many different types of breathing. Recently, I've been learning a lot of box breathing, which is inhale 4, hold, exhale 4, hold for 2 on both sides. But finding ways when we're so consumed throughout the day to carve out time or engaging with the world in a way that isn't so serious, right? And that goes to another topic of being productive without stressing. Being really engaged while maintaining a calm nervous system. And I think those two things, especially in corporate America, coming from a law firm where it was get on the phone, close the deal, send this email, every single second I have to be on call, right? So it can be really, really hard to be calm when all of these people are asking so much of us. But I think if you are making that effort to connect with yourself, whether that be at night when you come home or in the morning or in midday, you could really, really, really ground yourself in this inner knowing. And that inner knowing doesn't just go away. It's something we have to nurture. We have to water the plant. But the more often that you're watering it, the less quick the plant is going to be to die. It will take longer to get to that point of explosiveness. The longer the fuse is that you have. I think it's all about lengthening the fuse of our emotions by connecting with ourselves so that it takes you a lot longer to get to that really anxious, stressful point than it would when you weren't really doing all those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that honestly made me think of, like, again, when I was 23 and how I would come home from work, be so anxious, just like physically not feeling calm at all. And my coping mechanism was to have a dessert or a snack after I had dinner. And since I was so stressed, I would feel so hungry because my body wasn't able to put energy towards digesting. It was digesting. It was put everywhere else. And the funny thing is, at that time, I knew it's like, oh, I should probably go take like a long hot shower or bath or something to allow myself to calm down and relax and actually have more quality time with this spare time after work that I have. But I think the reason I didn't do that because I was so afraid of what I may feel or see at that point in time. So I think that's interesting because hearing you say it, and for me who's experienced it, doing something for 10 minutes, even 5 minutes, even 2 minutes, and letting yourself surrender to it can really switch your mood a lot so that you're not running on fumes. You're not running on empty energy. Like, you actually are filled back up. Like, it doesn't have to be this long process. You really can just snap back into feeling more whole. But you know what you think I know why that is? It's because I do spend time checking in and giving to myself. I think the motivation here is to build this sort of practice. It doesn't have to be like, I don't even like think about these things. I just do them when I feel stressed. But I think maybe like reflecting after doing it for a few months, because I think the goal is to not have it be like a habit, but to become like a lifestyle so that you can bounce back more quickly. So I think maybe putting more time into it when you're not feeling, putting a lot of time into it when you're not feeling great is worth it, because it's going to allow you to feel better and better and better as you go on and to bounce back quicker.
I have two things I'm going to say, but first, I think, that's the point, I think, of tools like meditation, is that like the point is not to have a very rigid practice where I have to meditate every morning. It's to learn the framework of setting your mind up to know that it's possible for me to not attach to my thoughts, and it's possible for me to find space and clarity from my mind when I feel anxious. But I want to go back to what you were saying about like, okay, 23-year-old Daisy would come home and splurge and eat all different foods or do all these different things, right? To kind of, what you're saying now, avoid how you were feeling. So let's just go back a little bit. Do you feel like you could comprehend in that moment that you were ignoring or facing yourself? Like, is this something you actively knew as a 23-year-old?
So I knew I was afraid. Going back to the example of like, this is really funny, looking like saying it out loud, but knowing that I shouldn't just sit there and binge Netflix and have a dessert or a snack. This is kind of a funny thing to think about and reflect on and say it out loud, because it was such a period of my life. But I would sit there binging TV, having my dessert or my snack because this was my time to feel better. And I would feel shitty as I was doing it. Eating the snack or the food, it wouldn't make me feel better. It would make me feel maybe worse, honestly. But it was a very quick second that I felt really good and that I'd feel worse. But I think in that moment, that was more appealing to me because I was afraid of going and just taking a shower. I was afraid to do that. So I think that was the level that I was aware of at that point in time in my life. I just knew that that sounded scary because I thought the only way to get relief was by what I was doing, even though I know it wasn't giving me relief. So it's kind of confusing, but I was at that time not thinking like, oh, I'm afraid to face myself. I certainly wasn't thinking that. It seemed scary, and it almost seemed like, oh, this is kind of a good way to put it. I was listening to Oh my gosh, I gotta stop mentioning Mel Robbins. But I was listening to it. I'm really on a Mel Robbins kick right now. I was listening to a neuropsychologist on her podcast today, and he was talking about how we don't want to have like dumps and dumps of dopamine. We want to have dopamine drips. So I think in this example, what that looked like was, for me, a dopamine dump was having processed food while watching a TV show. Like that's a lot. Like he was comparing it to like drinking alcohol or doing cocaine. Like these are like dumps of dopamine, and that's not good for us. It's like too much dopamine. But anyways, for this example, like a drip of dopamine would be getting up, taking a shower, unwinding, being with myself. Like that would be a drip of dopamine. So I think in that moment, I was so desperate to feel good that I was going for the dumps and the dumps of dopamine because that was more immediate and it was bigger. But looking in hindsight, that's probably why I was struggling so much, is because I was just going after all these dopamine hits, big ones, not to mention like drinking a ton on the weekends. So looking at that in hindsight, yeah, it was because there was such a habit of doing things that were depleting myself versus giving to myself. And I think the dopamine drips can often be filling yourself back up with healthy dopamine.
I truly think one of the most remarkable things that I've realized from this journey is how scared we are to face ourselves, how scared we are to look at ourselves. And, we're talking about 23-year-old you being anxious, coming home, binging the food. And it's like, you're too scared to even go and take that shower. Like you're too scared to even go for that walk. And I've been there before, because what it is, I think, is like, we are so scared of letting go. We're so scared to surrender, to not have something that's distracting us. And I used to be in so many spirals of just distraction. I'm anxious, distraction. It would just build until for me, it exploded in the sense of I recognize I don't want to be anxious all the time anymore. I don't want to be fearful all the time anymore. I want to be able to live my life in a way that's beautiful. And it's interesting because you're sitting here talking about dopamine, and I feel like, honestly, in a way now, I feel like I have dopamine all the time. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's just because I'm not caught up in my mind anymore. I'm not caught up in my thoughts. But really, most of the time now, except for when I'm dealing with like PMS, like I really feel good. And I think that's because I changed my definition of what good is. Like, I feel like I used to seek, like, feeling good, quote unquote, was I needed these highs. I needed extremes. I needed to be eating pizza at 2 a.m. when I got home from going out. Like, you're clinging so much to the highs because I think you're just so scared of feeling the lows. I think many of us spend our whole life operating like this, and it's sad.
Yeah. I mean, I can totally relate to being so afraid to face yourself, or just to, let alone have some alone time with yourself. But even on top of that, being so desperate to feel good that it has to be in a way that you're actually depleting from yourself, that is actually so artificial the way that you feel good. And by artificial, I mean processed foods and TV. That is such a small way to live. And I say that as someone who lived most of my life that way, where I was looking for cheap highs to feel better. And it becomes a cycle. And I really do think it shrinks your world to be really small. And I think it gets you to think really small. And I think you feel a lot of the times like out of fear. And I think it's really a mental health thing. It's like there's so many factors going into it. Like today on this podcast I was listening to, it's like when we are in a perpetual state of fight or flight, it increases our body fat, our belly fat specifically. So it's such a holistic view of health in these moments where it's really crazy that so many of us spend our lives this way, because I don't know, I think I'm just kind of recognizing how it's really sad. Like I lived that life for so long that I recognize that there's still probably so many people in that. And it is really such a small way. It's so sad, a small way to live life, because I think it's just a really hopeless place to be. And I guess I'm just trying to think back to like me when I was that age. And, yeah, like there was things I was trying to do to get out of it, but it felt so hard, honestly. So I'm trying to think what I would even say to that version of myself to help me get out of that. And I think one of the biggest things we can do for ourselves is remove the distractions. Truly. If you think that you're going to be miserable from not having your outlet of TV or processed foods or these kinds of things, I think if you're really afraid to remove it, because that is going to stop delaying the process of you working through the thing that you need to work through.
It's all about ripping off the Band-Aid, right? Like, I think it's just like we all it's like we patch up the Band-Aid every minute, every year, every month, whatever, when we don't look at ourselves. And I had the most looking at myself as I ever did when we took psychedelic mushrooms this year, of just like everything came up. But I think most people are living with that, carrying around all of these emotions in their emotional suitcase, that their backpack that's weighing them down their whole life. And like you're saying, it's so interesting. It's like we were like, oh, I don't want to remove that, I'm going to feel shitty. It's like, that is just making you feel shitty, the fact that it's in your life, because you're lying to yourself. You're not really confronting, you're not really seeing yourself. Like, you're living on autopilot, you're living in fight or flight. Like, you're just, and I don't know, I think like circling back to anxiety, circling back to all these emotions, is just like, I think a lot of anxiety, a lot of this fear is there because we're so deeply scared of those feelings that we've suppressed. Everyone. You're born, and then you go to school, you do all of these things, judgments are forming, something happens with your parents, something happens with your friends, something happens in your upbringing that really just was really hard for you, but you didn't have the emotional capacity to process it. And doesn't just have to be giant traumatic events. This is just being alive, right? Like, this is just being a human. Freedom truly is looking at yourself, because once you really, really look at yourself and you really do it, and I mean really do it, like, you're going to be crying. It's going to be so uncomfortable. But what is all the way at the end of that really good feeling you've been looking for the whole time, was just at the end of all those emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now I feel like I was just like whiplashed into like thinking about where I was at 23. I know we were going to do the whole episode about this, but I'm just like, it really got me, because I think if I could have seen where I am right now when I was 23, I would be floored. I truly would have been floored. I think it's hard to see the future when you're that age, especially yourself. And I think I bring that up because no matter where you are right now, you can do a full 360. Like, anything is really possible. You never are who you think you are. All of the ideas you have of yourself are from, I've said this before and I'll say it again, they're from how other people have perceived you, from past experiences, from other people's traumas projected onto you. So it's just, anything is possible for anyone. I think that's just a cheesy phrase, but no matter what place you're in, how dark it may be, as Noah Khan says, all lights that are turned off can be turned on. I think that is such a true piece of advice, because it's when you're in those places that are the darkest that you think that those lights cannot be turned on, because you're listening to the thoughts, but they always can be turned back on. And I think, we're talking about all these different things because anxiety is part of the full range of emotions, and every emotion impacts another emotion. Like, all emotions are jumping around and jumping into different places. But anxiety, I just think it is kind of like this is just my opinion, but I feel like it's kind of like a gateway into understanding your emotions. Because I kind of think maybe as like a woman who lives in New York City, maybe, I don't know if like women are like more are more likely to express anxiety. I feel like so many people I know are anxious, but I mean, regardless of what your age or gender is, I think that anxiety can kind of be the gateway to being like, all right, I need to figure something out. I kind of need to understand something's not right here. Like, I'm feeling I feel like I just kind of feel like anxiety is kind of like a gateway to understanding more emotions. I feel like it's one that's talked about often. I feel like it's one of those emotions that feels socially acceptable to talk about. Not that I even agree with that, but I think that it's common to hear that people are feeling anxious. I think it's a very common emotion. I think it's kind of it can be a very, I don't even want to say surface level emotion, but I think it's one that people aren't ashamed of. And I think it's one you can pick up on very easily. And I think it's also just prevalent. I think it's one of the most commonly felt emotions in our day to day, maybe because it leads deeply back to survival. I don't know. But I think it is just one of those emotions that if you start looking at that, I think for me, that's the emotion the first time I went to a therapist, I was like, I'm anxious. It was the very first thing. I thought, oh, I just have anxiety. But like, you start to unpeel it and peel it back and peel it more and more and more and more and more. And you realize, okay, no, I don't have anxiety. I'm a human being who experiences anxiety, and there's a whole load of other shit there. So that was kind of what I meant, was that I think oftentimes we can just be like, oh, like generalized anxiety disorder. And it's like, well, wait. No. There's so much more to that. But I think kind of seeking help for that oftentimes can help you understand. And it takes time to understand what's underneath there a little bit more.
I really just had like a processing moment when you said all that, where I was just kind of like, society kind of has agreed that being anxious is like this emotion that kind of we all experience, but it's not really like necessarily existential. Just like, it's like, oh, I'm anxious. Like kind of like a language we've created.
It's kind of been sterilized of, I think it's kind of been devalued.
Like we're missing the point.
Like anxiety is almost like it's like isolated or siloed or separate from everything else. Like, oh, you're just anxious, take this medicine, or you're just anxious, you have generalized anxiety disorder. Kind of separating it from the full range of emotions.
Right. It's like you're kind of missing the whole point that like, no, like fear of death is something we're all scared of. Like we're all scared of our mortality. And it's just like when we use a buzzword like anxiety, I think it's a really good way to kind of, you think about the stigma with mental health, right? It's like, oh, they have a mental illness, right? And you use that label, and then you use something like anxiety. I feel like it's almost like a way to be like, I'm experiencing these emotions, but I don't have to tell you how deep I don't know how I'm trying to explain this, but I think I'm just realizing that like anxiety to me feels like you said, it's like bare level 1 of level 5 of all the different emotions you have to go through to get to how you're really feeling. And I think we're all anxious about our existence. We all are, but that's just fear. Like you just see how it's all connected to like anxiety, which is fear of not having control or just fear or not liking what's happening in your life. It's every single thing we ever talk about in this podcast. So I just don't really see the difference. And I think that is relieving because you realize that anxiety is not something you have. Anxiety is something that you experience along with, accompanied by, or fear.
So I think this is really interesting and has me processing a lot too, because so much of my life I was always just like, oh, I'm anxious. So the first time that I took mushrooms and took a mushroom trip, yeah, I felt really anxious. And that was kind of the first thing that came up. And then the next time I took a mushroom trip, I didn't feel anxious anymore, because I think I really recognize, like, because you know how mushrooms, they really zoom you in on the thing that you're experiencing and kind of forces you to work through it or not resist it. I think having that experience allowed me to truly surrender to anxiety. I think that has been a pivotal experience for me, having that trip where I, several months afterwards, felt very anxious. And then finally one day just realized I can just surrender and relax into this. And I give that example as like a extreme anxiety where you feel like panic. And I think from having, and that probably sounds really terrifying to people listening, but I think in the right environment, it allows you to kind of go in at its most extreme and work through it. And you have that surrender experience on a mind altering substance that helps you kind of, I don't know if mind altering substance is the right word to say, because it's really just, you're just allowing yourself to,
it just peels you back.
Well, yeah, the mushrooms, like they really just peel you back and allow you to experience things as they really are. And I think just by doing that, everything else in my life that I get anxious about, I'm very much quickly able to get out of it much more quickly than I used to be. So I think just kind of giving the full viewpoint of where I was at 23 after taking mushrooms, now at 28, I have done a lot of reflection, I guess, especially with mushrooms, on facing these things. And I think the more you face things, the easier they get. But I will just say, like, kind of as a way to close up this conversation, or, you know, how we start the ending up of the conversation, I think that getting started is the hardest part. When you see no progress behind you, that's the hardest time, I think, to keep going. And at this point, like, we've been at this for years. The hardest part is certainly over. I think recognizing that you do have the capability to make progress and move past anxiety, but just looking at it in hindsight, it is a journey, and I think it's something you have to be willing to commit to for the long haul, for your entire life. It's something that you're never not on, and I think finding people who are also on that journey so you feel supported and not alone is really, really important. Whether that's a group, whether that's friends, whether it's a significant other, there's so many ways to get support, therapists, because I think that especially in your 20s, people start hitting different points in their life at different times. And I think you have to really listen to yourself. If you're starting to question, you know, I don't know how my life is, I kind of am looking to change it. I think it takes time. And that's just the honest truth, but it's worth it.
And it's just a recognition that, like, you are not your anxiety. You are not the emotions that arise. And you don't have to continue living in that state. No matter what anyone around you is telling you, like, you are not that. Recognizing that you are just the awareness of all this can give you the freedom to know that no matter how hard it is right now, no matter how tough these emotions are that you're experiencing, on the other side of feeling them is always freedom. It's always freedom. There is no, I don't think there's pain after, maybe pain is always there, but like so many beautiful emotions grow around it. This has been, honestly, I could talk about this for so long. Like, this is a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, this podcast, it did not start where it ended, but it never does.
But that's the whole point.
Well, the thing is, I'd be so curious because I feel totally different than when we started this conversation.
You're so much more relaxed.
Maybe that's all it ever is that I'm like extremely relaxed because I'm facing these things in real time.
You were really anxious before. I watched it happen.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'd be interested to hear from listeners if that helps them at all.
I'm sure it does, because
if you're feeling anxious and I'm feeling anxious in the beginning, and then I slowly start to feel less anxious, does the person who's listening who feels anxious, do they feel less anxious? Because they're not facing it directly, but simultaneously they are. I think I've been a listener of podcasts where that's happened, and it makes me feel less alone. So it makes me feel a little better hearing someone else work through it.
It's relief, right? And I think that's what this podcast in large part is, like, to let people know that they're okay. Like, it's okay. Like, you can work through it, and we're here for you because we're doing it simultaneously, man. Like, this, yeah, we've been at it for years and whatever, but like, we're still doing it. We're still human. So, yeah, I don't even want to stop talking, but like, we probably should got some more packing to do and got to edit the episode for tomorrow. But like, if you're listening, if you have any specific questions or want anything else to talk about this topic, DM us, email us. I think I'm thinking about like opening up this up more to our listeners. Like, write us in, connect with us, let us know any specific scenarios you want us to dive into, because we're considering doing a second episode. Might be a shorter segment. We're trying to figure that out. So we love to hear from you guys about what you think.
A second episode per week, to be specific.
A second episode per week. But as always, thank you so much for listening. This journey is a beautiful one, and it should be for everyone, right? I think that life is meant to be lived. There is so much beauty, and all I'm realizing on this journey is, as I experience all this beauty, is that like, I just want everyone else to have that too. So thank you so much for listening to Life Unpotted. And if this is your first episode with us, thank you so much for joining. We look forward to having you along this journey.